All right, so welcome back. Welcome to session 2 of the organizer session of the conference. A big thanks to Mark for also helping in organizing this. Okay, so there's a handout. Everyone has it? Great. Okay, so our next talk is by Mark Jago, who is another beloved member of the Truthmaker Semantics community. We should all be grateful to him for, well, many things, but among those, sort of creating the Truthmaker Semantics website. If you don't already know about this, you can sort of reach out to one of the organizers and we can direct you to it. It has a really nice collated list of all the publications in Truthmaker Semantics dating back to Ron Fossen, or some of the really early work that inspires a lot of the stuff that is being done at this conference. Mark's also done a lot of really important work in Truthmaker Semantics himself. And for those of you who don't know, Kit and Mark are currently working on a Truthmaker Semantics book, which I anticipate to be sort of the Bible when it comes out in the next year or two. Okay, and then today, Mark's going to be sort of applying Truthmaker Semantics to some issues in epistemology in this talk, Knowing by Tracking Parts. Oh, and just one other thing. If you haven't looked at the abstract for this talk, I highly recommend that you do. I think it's one of the all-time great abstracts in logic and philosophy and linguistics. So check it out if you haven't. All right, thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much, everyone. And in all fairness, I should say that the Truthmaker Semantics website with its lovely bibliography and the technology that makes that happen is very much down to Johannes, not me. What is Truthmaker Semantics for? What would we like it to be for? This is something I've been thinking about. And we have lots of interesting semantics for various logics, and new kinds of semantics seem to be coming out all the time. And we have interesting linguistic applications, and more and more of these are becoming evident. One thing I was thinking about is, to what extent can Truthmaker Semantics be used beyond these kind of applications to diagnose and solve philosophical problems? And maybe you think this is one of the reasons why possible world semantics in the 60s, 70s became such a dominant paradigm. It wasn't merely that it provided semantics for modal logics, but it seemed to give us extra tools, extra power in diagnosing philosophical problems in metaphysics, in epistemology, in philosophy of mind, through which we could try to really make sense of what was going on and diagnose and solve some of these problems. So it would be nice if we could use Truthmaker Semantics in a similar style, but to go beyond what we can do with possible worlds. So I'm trying to take a step towards that today by thinking about the problem of knowledge. So this talk is about Truthmaker Semantics, but it's kind of in a different style. So I'm going to talk for a bit about the problem of knowledge. How is it possible to know? So I take it that I know that I'm talking to you and you know you're listening to me. But how is that even possible, given that, insert your favorite skeptical challenge? We might be dreaming, we might be in the Matrix, we might be in some kind of horrendous AI-generated reality, we might be merely brains in vats. But how can we know anything? And there's a range of familiar responses to these kind of problems. We might concede the skeptic's challenge, but say, well, it doesn't matter for reasons X, Y, Z. Or we might be dogmatic and say, look, I just know that I'm talking to you, from which it follows that I'm not a brain in a vat. So I infer, so come to know that I'm not a brain in a vat. So I dogmatically insist that the skeptic intuition was just wrong from the start. Or maybe we take some contextual variation and we say, oh, I kind of know, I really do know that I'm talking to you, provided we don't think about being a brain in a vat. And as soon as we mention that, knowledge goes out the window. And these don't seem at all plausible to me. for various reasons I'm not going to go into here, but you can ask in the Q&A. What I want to try to pursue is an approach that seems utterly dead in the water, which is the idea that the skeptic's argument goes wrong because knowledge isn't closed. In particular, it's not closed under known implication. So I say, I know that I'm talking to guys right now. I also know that if I'm talking to you, I'm not a brain in a vat. I'm not in the Matrix. I'm not in an AI-generated scenario. But somehow it's still not the case that I can rule out those skeptical scenarios. How could I? If I were in them, things would seem just the same to me. Okay, so somehow the skeptic's argument fails because my knowledge, your knowledge, isn't closed under known implication, very simple known implications. So this isn't the problem of logical omniscience, whereby somehow our knowledge fails to be closed under typically very difficult inferences, which perhaps we don't get to know through lack of resources. This is a different issue. It's a very simple one-step inference, seemingly from something that I take myself to know to something it seems I can't know. I'm not even in a position to know that I'm not a brain in a vat, and all the resources in the world won't help me come to know that. So tracking theories of knowledge, going back to people like Nozick, or at least it's most commonly associated with Nozick, seem to give us some interesting results here. So the idea of tracking I have on the handout here is your beliefs track the truth of some proposition, where, putting it in counterfactual terms, if it wasn't true, you wouldn't believe it. But if it were true, you would believe it. The simple tracking theory of knowledge says you know something when you believe it, it's true, and your belief tracks the truth, perhaps with some complications about the ways it tracks that truth, but which I'm going to ignore. Tracking has an interesting consequence. I know where my keys are from the room. I tend to lose my keys. So this morning I was very careful to lock the door and kind of mentally kind of visualize putting the key in my jacket pocket. So I know where my key is. I made very, very, careful to memorize this. But do I know that one of you guys hasn't, during the break when I wasn't in here, taken it and swapped it for an exact duplicate? Well, I don't know that. How could I know that? I wouldn't be able to tell until I get back to the room and check whether my key works or not. But if my key is where I think it is, it hasn't been swapped by that exact duplicate. But I still take it I know where my key is. If you ask me where's your key, I'll say it's in my pocket. And I take that to be a case of knowledge. If that's not a case of knowledge, pretty much nothing is. So here's a simple case where tracking predicts seemingly the right kind of data. I know some stuff, but I don't. But I'm not in a position to rule out the kind of skeptical variant of this. Kripke has a nice case. I know where my key is. Do I automatically know from that that any evidence to the contrary is misleading? No. And similarly in the skeptical case. I know I'm talking to you, but I can't from that rule out the possibility that I'm a brain in a vat. Tracking seems to give us the right kind of moves here. But, and the reason why I think most people take tracking theories of knowledge to be absolutely dead in the water is they have this logical problem. Famously pointed out by Kripke, I think first by Kripke, but I'm not sure on that. But here's the problem as Kripke puts it. You can know that this thing over here is a red barn without knowing that it's a barn. He's thinking about these kind of fake barn cases. But the problem is completely general. You can track a conjunction without tracking a conjunct. Okay, so on the simple tracking theory of knowledge, you can know a conjunction without knowing one of its conjuncts. And that just seems a terrible, terrible prediction for any theory of knowledge. And a couple of years back, maybe a decade back, I did some work with Ray Briggs on this, just to kind of see how general the problem is. It's really, really bad. It's really general. So you can know, according to the tracking theory, you can track a conjunction without tracking a conjunct. You can track a conjunction even when one of the conjuncts is unknowable, and you can track certain conjunctions even though you don't track either conjunct. Okay, this looks really bad, and I express tracking in terms of counterfactuals. Well, you might think this depends on your theory of counterfactuals. Not really. We went through an awful lot of theories of, theories that are out there of counterfactuals. They all give you this kind of problem. So it seems like it's just a feature of tracking that it has this bad, bad problem, which seems to make it inadmissible as a theory of knowledge. Strangely, slight tangent here, tracking theories have been around for a long time. There's not a huge amount of literature on their logic. The first thing I could find comes from Wes Holliday in 2015, where he has this wonderful long paper setting out semantic theories and giving axiomatizations of various modal accounts of knowledge, including tracking theories, relevant alternative theories. And essentially the picture is you have a fairly standard modal theory. The tracking theory of knowledge is a fairly standard modal theory. Apart from knowledge of a conjunction doesn't imply knowledge of conjuncts. And if you added that as an axiom, you just collapse to a standard modal logic where the knowledge operator is just a standard box operator, so you get closure under all kinds of implications. In particular, the skeptical argument would then be a valid one. So it seems there's this kind of bind. Tracking theories don't give you knowledge of the conjuncts from knowledge of the conjunctions, but if you added that back as an explicit feature, you would just get complete closure under all kinds of closure, and the skeptical argument would be unavoidable. That seems to be the bind. But here's a very simple-minded suggestion. What if we tried to avoid the problem by saying, in order to know something via tracking, you need to track a bit more than just that proposition. In particular, to know a conjunction, you need to track not just it, but also the conjuncts. To know a conjunction, you need to track its conjuncts. There are two immediate problems with that suggestion. Firstly, what counts as a conjunction? Not just sentences written down with a little wedge in the middle. There's going to be an awful kind of, a lot of things that we can know that seem to exhibit the kind of problem Kripke pointed out. So knowing somebody to be a bachelor, seems I can't know that John is a bachelor unless I know that he's unmarried. But so we have to kind of say, in what sense does knowing somebody to be a bachelor count as a conjunction for the purposes of the analysis here? Negated disjunctions as well. If I know not P or Q, it seems I should know not P. So we need some criterion. If this kind of suggestion is going to have any traction, we need a good criterion of what counts as a conjunct. But secondly, the problem I just alluded to, if we throw back in closure under conjunctions, won't this approach just collapse straight back into standard modal logic where we have from knowing A and knowing if A then B, then we automatically get knowing B, and the skeptic's argument then becomes unavoidable, and it turns out, we've got an analysis of knowledge on which we don't really know anything. That's not a great. Here's where Truthmaker Semantics comes in finally. Truthmaker Semantics, one thing it does really, really nicely is gives a very general analysis of what a conjunction of a proposition is, in a way that is naturally designed or naturally has a consequence that it avoids the bad things I was talking about here. Okay, so let's take a proposition to be a set of states, and we say that a conjunctive part of that proposition is one like this definition here. It's Kit's definition of a conjunctive part. And essentially, P is going to be a part of Q, where every way of making P true looks up at a way of making Q true, and every way of making Q true looks down as a part, a way of making P true. So P is neither too big nor too small to count as a conjunct. Not every consequence of a proposition will count as a conjunction. So if you think about the possible worlds analysis of a proposition, a conjunction is just going to be a superset of that proposition. But that's also the notion of entailment. Okay, so in the possible worlds analysis of a proposition, a conjunct of the proposition is just anything it entails. Okay. And that's obviously no good for what we've got here, because then you just get closure under entailment for free. But here we've got a notion of a conjunct, which, without any funny business, allows us to make the distinction between taking a conjunct of P and Q without treating P or Q as a conjunct of P. We're making this distinction between the ways in which a proposition entails its conjuncts and the way in which a proposition entails its disjuncts that you can't do with classical. So using this notion of a conjunctive part, let's say that you know a proposition through tracking when believe it, it's true, and your beliefs track not just that proposition, but every conjunctive part of that proposition. Okay? You have to you have to track each conjunctive part of the proposition in order to know it. Okay, so here we have something like a project, right? Let's try to formalize this using Truthmaker Semantics and look at what kind of closure principles we get to see if we make any traction on the problem. And in particular, how do we deal with the problem of, well, it's not just the fact that seemingly I know that I'm talking to you, but I also know that if I'm talking to you, then I'm not a brain in the back. I know both these things, so it seems like I know I'm talking to you, and if I am, then I'm not a brain in the back. Are we going to avoid the consequence that that will imply knowing that I'm not a brain in the back? So have we made any progress here? And can we use a model of Truthmaker Semantics to kind of answer these questions? Okay, so there are lots of moving parts to this definition. And I want to try and model these by simplifying, or maybe you think cheating. So I'm taking some inspiration here from the way Hannes presented things. Let's just simplify when we can. So I'm not doing this fully within Truthmaker Semantics. I've got a kind of a world semantics and a Truthmaker Semantics cobbled together in just the easiest way I could think of. So what we're going to do is we're not going to be cooking up truth makers for knowledge statements. Too complicated. Rather, we're just going to deliver judgments about whether knowledge ascriptions are true or not in terms of Truthmaker propositions. Let's see what I've got going on here. So we have some worlds. Let's start with the worlds. Standard possible worlds, and we've got an ordering on them, and we're going to use that to analyze, as it were, to analyze the counterfactual. So kind of very much like what Lucas was doing. If we have a standard ordering semantics for counterfactuals, where I consider a counterfactual to be true. When all of the closest A worlds are B worlds. So if A, then B is going to be true when the closest A worlds are B worlds. I'm just doing the counterfactual part of the theory, so the tracking part of the theory, going to be mostly dealt with in terms of this partial order on worlds. Truthmaker semantics comes in here when we look at the objects of knowledge. Okay, so when we look at the propositions that are known or believed. So to know something, you have to believe it, and you have to track, your beliefs have to track that proposition. So the objects of tracking, the propositions, are going to be analyzed in the Truthmaker semantics way. They're going to be sets of states. So in addition to our worlds, we have disjoint from that some states which are ordered by parthood into a state space, and we take a proposition to be a set of those states. And the way I'm analyzing belief is very simple. We're going to take for each world doxastic function which assigns your total belief state. Just a proposition. Okay, so for each world there is for each world there's a proposition which specifies your total belief in that world. And what it is to believe something relative to that world. So you believe that P relative to W if P is the conjunctive part of your total belief state in that world. That's a very natural way of dealing with belief in Truthmaker semantics. So the big proposition that is assigned to world W specifies, as it were, the conjunction of all your beliefs. So you believe something in that world if that proposition is one of those conjuncts, a conjunctive part of the total belief set at that world. For this approach, it's very simplified because we haven't got any way of iterating belief operators, knowledge operators, nothing like that. So when I talk about a proposition, I'm talking about a non-modal, a non-doxastic, a non-epistemic proposition, just something expressible in the language of propositional logic. Okay, very much like what Luke said. Is it possible to get a proper, genuine, truth makers all the way through model of this stuff? Yeah, I guess that's possible, but not at all trivial. In particular, if you want to order states by their relevance to one another or by their dissimilarity from one another or closeness or however you want to think about it, really, I don't think that's going to be trivial because you have to think about how the parts of a state affect the relevance of the things they're part of. Not very clear how to do that. So what do? Well, simplify/cheat and order only the worlds that behave in the way that we know and, love, hate, depending on the application. Okay. So, within this kind of hybrid approach, some stuff done by worlds, some stuff done by Truthmaker propositions, we can define belief at a world in terms of that proposition being a part of your total belief set. We can define tracking. That's what's going on there. I introduced tracking before in counterfactual terms. Here, I'm just going sort of straight for the standard-ish clauses for very simple account of counterfactuals. If you don't think that really is a good clause for the counterfactual, forget the bit about counterfactuals and just take this as a direct definition of tracking. So basically we're saying you track a proposition, so the A here, that A is going to be thought of in terms of a Truthmaker proposition when, we're thinking about it in both ways. We're analyzing it both as a set of worlds. That's what we've got in these brackets. And as a Truthmaker proposition, which we've got here, something you either do or don't believe. So all of the closest or most relevant worlds where it's false, you don't believe it. And all of the closest or most relevant worlds where A is true, you do believe it. Okay, that's what it is to track something. to track a proposition, and you know a proposition when it's true, and you track each conjunctive part of it. So this notation here is it's the truthmaker proposition associated with it. So I haven't said here also that you believe it because the ordering here is a partial order. It's reflexive, so it's going to follow from this that if it's true in the actual world or the base world, then the fact that you track it will imply that you believe it. So this includes the case where you believe it. Okay, so those are simple models. What kind of results do we get? This part was very much motivated by Wes Holliday's paper on logical properties, closure properties of tracking in the possible world setting. He has some really, really nice results on what kind of closure principles we get. Not in the Truthmaker case, but in the possible worlds case. His paper is incredibly detailed. He considers the case of embedded modalities, epistemic modalities, which makes life very complicated. Luckily for me, the reasoning to get these closure principles is very, very simple. Think about belief first, just straightforward belief. So if you believe some things, under what conditions will that imply? So this notion here is just classical entailment, not truthmaker entailment. Under what conditions will believing some things imply believing another thing? Well, maybe unsurprisingly, it's just going to be in the case in which in every model, the proposition expressed by C is a conjunctive part of the conjoined proposition expressed by the conjunction of A1 through AN. In other words, that's just its notion, or Angle's notion of analytic entailment. Okay, Truthmaker Semantics also. A1 through AN imply in AC C. Lots of A's and C's there. But so we have a very kind of truthmakerish notion of belief. In particular, believing A won't imply believing A or C. And the intuition here is something like, well, sure, it's a very easy deduction from A to A or C, but C might involve some concept I'm not even aware of. So I'm not guaranteed to believe A or C on believing A because I might not even be aware of C. So Stolnaker gives a nice example. He talks about William III of England, who believed war with France was avoidable, but we don't want to infer from that he believed that nuclear war was avoidable. Okay, that's not the kind of belief we should attribute to somebody who was several hundred years before the power was a concept in circulation. So beliefs are going to be fairly constrained. Tracking is going to exhibit the same kind of features on the possible truthmaker propositions as it does on sets of worlds propositions. In particular, we're going to have the failure of tracking conjunctions. You can you can track a conjunction without tracking one, and in some cases without tracking either of its conjuncts. But what happens when we put all of this together? Well, really, the principles of elements we get with belief end up kind of dominating what happens here. And we end up with the principle that if you know some things, under what conditions must you know a further thing? Well, one condition is when, because we're talking about a classical notion of truth here, if the things were inconsistent, you would end up knowing that thing. Now, that's not a case we can take into account here because we're requiring these things to be true. So maybe I should have wiped out that case. That's a case that Holliday considers just because he's thinking of a very general epistemic modality. Sure, yeah. The case we're really interested in is knowing some things will imply knowing something else, just in case, again, we have this analytic containment inference. So in particular, like in the case of belief, it's not going to be the case that knowing something, A, implies knowing arbitrary disjunctions involving that thing, okay? And again, the intuitive idea here is, well, maybe those arbitrary disjunctions involve concepts that you're just not aware of. However, I think there's more to it than that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this at the end of the talk. Okay. Yeah, actually, I think what's going on here is, so take the inference from A to A or B. You know A, but I'm saying you might not know A or B. So sure, the truth of A or B is going to be guaranteed by what you know. But there's more to knowing something on this approach than merely what you previously know guaranteeing its truth, okay? And there's something here about the subject matter expanding from what you know into territory that you don't know. Okay. And it's this principle that I think is going to give us the right diagnosis of the skeptical cases. The idea that knowledge is closed specifically under analytic implication is not completely unheard of. So a couple of years ago, Sam Elgin proposed this idea. He doesn't situate this in terms of truthmaker semantics. He just has he takes the sort of axiomatization of AC and says, oh, these principles look the right kind of principles for closure of knowledge. Okay, so the idea is out there, but I'm very much here coming from the sort of the semantic point of view. Okay. So we have some truthmaker or hybrid models for knowledge where it seems we can kind of diagnose what's going on. We need to use these to go back to that the kind of revenge problem, not just how do you know that you're here listening to the talk, even if you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, but also let's suppose you know that you're here, and you also know that if you're here, then you're not a brain in a vat. You know both those things. How on earth are we going to avoid the bad conclusion that that this implies knowing that you're not a brain in a vat, which we take to be unknowable? The first thing to note here is the way I've put this argument involves an implication, and we haven't so far said anything about implication. Okay, so one worry is the only way we've quote unquote avoided the worry is by missing out an account of what a sensible arrow means. There's a whole bunch of different options for what the arrow might mean in truthmaker semantics. So the relevant consideration here is what the arrow means in truthmaker semantics, because we're considering knowledge of the propositions which are going to be expressed as sets of states. So the relevant consideration is, what does truthmaker semantics say about the arrow? There's a whole bunch of different options, but what they all seem to have in common is that truth makers for A, arrow C should be taking me from any A state I happen to pick to some C state. Okay, I have to consider all of the A states, but I don't have to consider all of the C states. And typically what's going to happen is these A states might take me just into some subset of the C states. Okay, so when I think about fusing or conjoining if A then C with A, well, for sure, I want modus ponens. So that's going to take me into or above, if it's an inexact notion, some of the C states, but it's not going to take me into or above all of the C states. So what's happening here is from A and if A then C, I for sure get the truth of C. I get some truth makers for C, but I don't get the full content or the full subject matter of C. Okay. And if we're thinking that subject matter is important for belief, like in the case of not being able to infer from A to A or C, because that's a principle we think involving an illicit expansion of subject matter. It's the same kind of principle going on here. Okay, so the semantics will predict that can know A and if A then C without knowing C. And this won't really be to do with any of the principles of tracking. It's much more to do with the simple fact that it's possible to believe those propositions without believing the consequence. Okay, so our knowledge somehow guarantees the falsity of skepticism, but there's content to the skepticism that somehow what we know doesn't rule out. It rules out the truth of it, but in a way that doesn't preserve knowledge. I think that's a very I think it's difficult to understand what's going on there, because often we think about knowledge simply as ruling out the truth, guaranteeing the truth of something or ruling out the truth of alternatives. But I mean, I don't think that this is the same issue here as the issue of logical omniscience. But just for a moment, think about the issues of logical omniscience. If knowledge was purely about some guarantee of truth, we would be saying that by definition, you know every tautology and you know every logical consequence of anything you know, because whatever you know, that guarantees the truth of every tautology and every consequence of what we know. If we think there's more to knowledge than that, such that you don't know every consequence of logical consequence of what you know, then knowledge can't simply be a guarantee of truth. There must be more to it than that. And the suggestion is what knowledge requires above guarantee of truth is something like inclusion of subject matter. Nice idea. I wondered, has anyone discussed this? It was almost a priori that somebody discussed it, and that somebody was Steve Yablo. So his aboutness book, it is just full of these sort of wonderful ideas that some of them have been really developed. I think some haven't, and I haven't seen a huge number of people pick up on this idea, but it's very much there. So he says he's talking about ampliative reasoning, so reasoning that somehow expands the content of what you started with. Okay, so skeptical consequences of some proposition are expanding, ampliative in this way, not of the truth conditions. After all, they have to have sort of fewer truth conditions, because if it's a deductive inference, the ways that this can be true should already include the ways that this can be true. But there is an expansion of aboutness or subject matter. There is, as it were, more to the skeptical consideration than what we started with. But that more isn't about its truth. Okay. And Yablo claims that the expansion of aboutness rather than the expansion of truth conditions is what makes the skeptical consideration harder to know than what we started with. And that's very much what I've gone for here, and what the semantics is telling us. Okay. I was going to finish there, but I had sort of a panicky moment in the shower this morning, with a worry that I don't think it has a name, so I thought I'd better give it a name, and I'm really bad at coming up with names. So the name is going to be subject matter stuffing. It's the idea that we can take something you believe or know and just kind of automatically stuff it full of junk subject matter. Okay. Consider anything that you might consider. Okay. We've been considering whether we are brains or brains in vats. I don't know either way, but I can consider whether I am or not. So that seems to force me to consider both cases. I'm a brain in a vat, I'm not. I consider their disjunction. Either I am or I'm not. I don't know which, but I seem to know the disjunction, right? It's a tautology. It's the simplest tautology. Either I'm a brain in a vat or I'm not. You'd be crazy to think you don't know that. So, considering all the things I claim to know, I know that I'm talking to you. I know that if I'm talking to you, I'm not a brain in a vat, but either I'm a brain in a vat or I'm not. That known proposition, unfortunately, contains the full subject matter of I'm not a brain in a vat. When you put it all together, that known proposition contains both a guarantee of the truth of I'm not a brain in a vat, from the I know I'm talking to you, and I know I'm talking to you, implying I'm not a brain in a vat. So as long as our arrow preserves modus ponens, we get a guarantee of truth. But I've also got the full subject matter of I'm not a brain in a vat. So there's a guarantee of truth with no expansion of subject matter. Our diagnosis looks shaky. Obviously, we need to check what the semantics says. So the semantics, as we've got it at the moment, actually wiggles out of this problem. But I don't know whether the way it wiggles out of it is an acceptable wiggling or a kind of illicit, trickery kind of wiggling. So you're going to have to tell me. What's going on, in effect, is that to know a proposition, you have to know why it's true in the cases where it's true. So in the close cases where A or not A is true, because A is true, your beliefs have to track that. You have to be aware that in those close cases, that's why it's true. And in close cases where A or not A is true because A is false, you have to believe that. Okay, so at least in the close, the nearby, the relevant cases, you have to be aware of why that tautology is true, not just that it's true. So in the time between this morning's shower and now, I've sort of flipped between, oh, this is a nice explanation, this is a terrible explanation, and I'm not quite sure which I'm settling on, so maybe you guys can tell me. But really, in a way, we have this strange sounding constraint. To know something, it's really more about knowing, appreciating, at least in relevant cases, the grounds for its truth, rather than merely knowing, oh, it's true because it's a tautology or because it's necessary or whatever. In some ways, this is kind of much on a par with what we said about the cases of logical omniscience, right? Just because something is an axiom doesn't follow that I automatically know it. I mean, there's a kind of a forced march argument from, here are the axioms. I've told you that these are the axioms of the logic, so, you know them. And trivially, you can do modus ponens. I mean, it'd be crazy to think that you knew A, if A then B, but not B. oh, consequence, you know all consequences of what you know. Okay. If we're going to avoid those kind of arguments, so a kind of a forced march to logical omniscience, it seems like what we are saying is there's some trivial logical consequence of what we know that perhaps we don't know. What I'm saying here is that in these kind of cases, it's not about resources. I mean, in those trivial consequence type examples, resources don't seem to be the right diagnosis of what goes wrong. You know, it's not like your limited resources stop you doing one step of modus ponens or whatever. Okay, the diagnosis is something more semantic to do with the meaning of the propositions and really what we're taking knowledge to be. Knowing is much more a matter of knowing how a proposition gets to be true, at least in the relevant cases, rather than just clocking it to be of the form A or not A, or a consequence of a simple one-step consequence of what you know. Okay, thanks very much.